Hi everyone, I'm Vivian of Frippery, and I'm here today to give you some tips and tricks that will improve the final look of your finished costume, whether it's historical or cosplay. I believe small things add up to big effects, and hopefully some of these tips that I'm going to give you today will help you out. This is part of the Arda Wigs Summer Seminar Series, so I urge you to go check out their blog and their YouTube to look at the other lectures that have been put out by other creators. So thank you, Arda, for sponsoring this video. I'm going to go over picking the right size pattern, making it fit you, making sure it hangs right, and also making sure that your seams and stitches look clean, neat, and invisible. So I will go over what the numbers on the back of a pattern envelope mean, but first you will need to take your measurements, your bust, your waist, and your hip. I recommend getting a tape measure. If you don't have one, you can use a piece of string and then pull that against a ruler or a yardstick. So your bust measurement is simply the widest part of your chest. Your waist measurement is the narrowest part of your torso. If you are having a little trouble determining where that is, simply bend at the side, and that fold is where your waist measurement is. Your hip measurement is the widest part of the lower half of your body. That should be in the upper hip region. And if you are having issues determining where that is, use your booty as a reference point. So now that we've determined your body measurements, it's time to pick a pattern size to cut out. We will talk about mock-ups later, but first let's focus on picking a pattern size to start with. So most companies will put a pattern size on the back of an envelope. Depending on the company though, this location might vary. Some companies like to hide them in the envelope flap. And in some cases, you might have the measurement chart on a sheet of instructions that are included with the pattern. As you can see, to determine the size that you should be cutting, the pattern asks you to refer to your bust, your waist, and your hip. For this particular company, they have decided that your hip is 9 inches below your waist, which is a helpful way to help you approximate that, but it's going to depend on your height and your body shape. So for example, if you have a 36-inch bust and a 28-inch waist and a 38-inch hip, they are saying that you should cut out the size 14 of this pattern. Pattern sizes do not match clothing and manufacturing sizes, so don't pay attention to what you think your normal clothing size should be, but what this particular pattern chart says. What if, though, you have a 36 bust and a 30-inch waist, or any kind of other set of measurements where they are not matching exactly the standard pattern block that they have? You should go to your largest measurement and pick the size based on that, because it is easier to take a pattern in, that is, reduce the size somewhere, than to add extra fabric somewhere else. Keep in mind, this is just a starting point. We are going to make a mock-up to better fit that pattern to your body type. Now, once you have picked out your pattern size, you are going to be able to figure out how much fabric to buy. So fabric most commonly comes in a 45-inch width and a 60-inch width, and depending on how wide the fabric you buy, you may need more or less of it. So if you figure out that you are doing this size of the pattern, this is how much fabric you need to buy depending on which piece you are making. Now you'll notice that there is a body measurement section, but there's also a finished garment measurement section, and that are different. That's because a finished garment measurement includes something called ease. That's extra room that they've built into the garment to give you a little bit of space around your body. Depending on the type of garment and depending on the manufacturer, the amount of ease varies a lot. So you might have less ease for a pair of pants, but a lot of ease for a loose-fitting jacket. And for a historical garment, like a corset, you might even have negative ease, meaning that the garment is going to be slightly smaller than your finished measurements. So depending on what kind of pattern you choose, you need to pay attention to the ease. And in the case of certain garments, like a loose fitting cape that's all size fits one, you may not have an ease chart at all. So now you have figured out what pattern size to start with. The next step is to figure out how to fit it to you specifically. The point of a mock-up is basically a practice to test out your pattern and make sure that size fits you. The importance of this is, as we've demonstrated on the pattern envelope, ease varies a lot depending on the garment and depending on the manufacturer, and also you're just not always shaped exactly the same way as the standard block that the company is using. So you need to start out by testing the pattern before you cut into your more expensive fabric. And you can use bed sheets, you can use cheap fabric from the thrift store, you can use scraps from previous projects, or you can buy bolts of muslin for this purpose. Now, once you do that and you get to a point where it fits you right, then you're going to take that apart and use those pieces to trace out your final fashion fabric instead of the original paper pattern. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, you want me to make a whole second garment in order to make one finished garment at the end. And in a way, yes, but trust me, it's going to save yourself a lot of trouble. You don't want to cut into your fancy or expensive fabric and then find out at the end, whoa, that does not fit me at all, because the pattern is based on a standard block. And you might be taller or shorter than their model, you might have narrower or wider shoulders, your bust point might be lower or higher up. And you don't want to find out at the end, after you've spent a lot of time and money, it doesn't fit you at all. Now, another reason why a mock-up is not always wasted effort is actually if you use your lining fabric to make your mock-up and it's close enough to you, you might be able to just reuse it for your lining. One thing you want to make sure that you do when you're sewing your mock-up or your final costume is that you stick to the seam allowance that the pattern tells you to, because if you're off, all of those seams are going to add up and eventually your costume is going to be too big or too small to fit you. Now the important thing though is that your mock-up fabric should approximate your final costume fabric. If you are using a stretchy fabric for your costume, you need to use a stretchy fabric for your mock-up as well. If your fabric is thin or thick or has a particular way it moves, you need to take that into account as well. Now, I've talked about the importance of choosing the right fabric for your mock-up, but let's talk about drape. So drape is how the fabric hangs, okay? Some fabric is slinky, some fabric is a little more stiff. Depending on your project, you want to choose the right drape. If you're making a coat, you want something that's going to be thick and it's going to hang right. If you're making like a slinky 30s dress, you want it to be kind of clingy. Now, what if the fabric you have does not have quite the same or the correct drape that you want? Well, you can help fix that with the lining. A lining is an additional layer of fabric inside, and sometimes it's just so that you have a nice, smooth, finished look inside the garment, but sometimes it also helps your garment hang right. The lining is there to add a little bit of thickness and also to make your garment look less see-through, and in the end that's going to also improve the polish of it. It's going to make it look a little more professional and clean. Now there's two ways to do a lining. You can sew your outer fabric by itself, sew the lining by itself, and then put the two together at the end. So a garment like this, where the inside you can see the seams are all finished, that's the way it was constructed, the lining and the outer separately. However, there's another technique called flatlining. Flatlining is where you sew all the individual pieces of the lining to the matching piece of the fashion fabric, and then you construct the garment together. That's useful for when you have something very fitted like a Victorian bodice and you really, really want that tightness. My favorite way to flatline is to actually just serge the lining and the fashion fabric together, and this way for constructing my garment, this piece is now treated as one. And a time-saving tip, what you can do is instead of cutting out both your lining and your fabric, you cut out one, you put it on top of the other piece, and then you let your serger blade sew and cut the fabric for you at the same time. The final precision of your sewing is also affected by how the items are attached together before you start sewing. So most of the time you can pin your seams or your zippers, for example, together. However, for something that's fiddly like a zipper, I prefer hand basting. That's where you take a hand needle and just sew these big stitches through your zipper to your fabric. It is a temporary method of attachment. But the nice thing about basting is that for something really wiggly like a zipper, you see that this is going to shift less in a sewing machine than something that's pinned. Next, let's talk about what pressing your seams open means, or pressing your seams flat. That means you go to the inside and you use an iron and you press your seams until they open up like a book. And the reason for that is so that on the outside you'll get a nice crisp flat look instead of a valley or kind of a bump. And if you do that for all of your seams, overall you're going to have a much better polished look at the end. Finally, let's talk about finishing your hems. Now the most common way is for someone to fold up the bottom and then fold up the bottom again and then stitch it down. However, this ends up with a visible stitch line on the outside. So we're going to talk about how to do an invisible or blind hem. So to make what is called an invisible or blind hem, what you do is you do fold down the edge of your fabric and fold it again like you do for a regular machine hem. But when you hand stitch it, you first take a few threads with your needle and then push it through the folded part. And then you travel a bit and you take a few more threads and then again push your needle through the folded part and travel again and push your needle through and put it through the folded part. Now I am taking some rather large stitches to be able to demonstrate this, but depending on your personal choice, you may want to have your stitches closer together. But the idea is on the outside, you're not going to have that visible stitch line, just a few little pinpricks here and there that won't be super visible. So the technique I just showed you is very useful for hems, but also you can adapt that for collars and cuffs. So if you do the finishing of your collars and cuffs with these little hand stitches on the inside, that prevents you from having a machine stitch line on the outside. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found some of the information useful, and remember that sewing should not be scary. Thank you again to Arda Wigs for asking me to make this video. And if you are watching this the weekend of the Comic-Con at Home Her Universe fashion show, you can see an Arda Wigs wig in action. I will be wearing one for my Her Universe fashion show look. So go check out the show and go check out Arda Wigs.